Hey everybody, welcome back to the Success Secrets Revealed live stream show with Ronald Couming, your host, and we have fabulous guests every week. Just like today, we have Mitzi Perdue, and she is a treasure trove of history as well as, an accomplished author and speaker in her own right. Just a little bit about Mitzi, and then I'll read her bio in a second. Her father is the founder of the Sheridan chain, and it was actually right here in Cambridge, Mass. She'll give us a little insight into that and how he ran his business, as well as she was married to Frank Perdue of, Perdue chicken fame. I mean, talk about, running in circles that most people, we can't even imagine, right? So, and she's written a book and done a lot of wonderful things for charity and philanthropy. So we'll get to Mitzi in a second. I wanted to tell you about how this show got created. Success Secrets Revealed really became about, because I have a radio show on WCAP 980 AM, and that because of COVID, they're not manning the station, so they're running reruns. Now, I was doing it. I mean, the show's still alive, Internet Marketing and Business Solutions with Ronald Couming, but they're running reruns. So even though those episodes were great, they're not, they're not dealing with like maybe what's going on now with COVID and how so much has changed now than a year ago. So I pivoted. So now what I'm doing is I'm doing these live streams. I'm stripping out the audio. I'm sending that to the radio station so they can put the fresh feed, the fresh information into the feeds. And we get to hear from some great people. We have one sponsor. No guest pays to be on this show. No guest gets paid to be on the show. I don't get paid to be on the show. This is purely just for us to give back and, contribute to the betterment of other people, because all of us have had people help us in the past too, right? So with that said, I'm going to read now Mitzi's bio. And yes, I'm going to put on some glasses. So Mitzi Perdue holds a BA with honors degree from Harvard University and an MPA from George Washington University. She is a past president of the 350,000 member American Agri-Women, a former syndicated columnist for Scripps Howard and her television series. Country magazine was syndicated to 76 stations. She is the founder of CERES, CERES Farms, and the family-owned company that owns commercials and residential real estate, and plus agricultural land, including vineyards that sell wine, grape, and wineries such as Mondavi, Bogle, Viola, Deluxe, and Toasted Heads. Mitzi Perdue's book, How to Make Your Family Business Last, gives practical advice on how a family business can develop a culture that supports keeping that family business in the family. Her I've lived it experience comes from memberships in two long-lasting family enterprises. Her family origins began in 1840 with the Henderson Estate Company, forerunner of the Sheridan Hotels, which her father co-founded, Perdue Farms. She's Frank Perdue's widow in 1920. Her most recent book, co-authored with Mark Victor Hansen and Preston Weeks, is designed to help people survive and thrive during the pandemic that we're all going through. Please help me welcome Mitzi Perdue. Hey!
What a complete joy to be here with you, and I'm eager to share stuff that I hope might be useful to people.
Oh, definitely. Misty, I mean, you are literally a treasure trove of information on seriously, but you've lived it. Your father was a co-founder of Sheridan, your husband, Frank Perdue, but, it's not like you weren't part of that. Yeah, they were, but, you were part and parcel of that. You listened, you learned, you saw, you've gone on to get your MBA and an MBP, which is?
Master of Public Administration.
Exactly.
So I'm just all set to run the country. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Maybe we need you to run. You know what I mean? We could use some good candidates on both sides. Okay, but so anyhow, tell us a little bit about your history. I mean, it is so magnificent. I mean, you're like I said, you were born in the Boston area. Your father helped co-found, a lot of people don't know this, the Sheraton hotel chain started. He bought 2 hotels here in Cambridge, right, or in the area, and then it grew and grew and grew. But how he dealt with people when he first bought something, how he sat people down when they thought they were getting fired. I mean, can you just give us a little history about that? Then we'll go into Frank, then we'll talk about your book and everything else.
I'd absolutely love to. Well, first, you might be interested, being a good Bostonian, how Sheraton got its name. And the Sheraton hotel chain began in the 1930s at the height of the Great Depression. So almost everything that I'm going to share with you about how Sheraton got started, because there's really bad times. I mean, really. In Boston, at the height of the Great Depression, unemployment was 25%. So, that was a bad time. And so some of the things that he did, I think, count for today, because we're going through a rough time now too. But how Sheraton got its name. When he had bought, you mentioned 3 hotels. By the time he bought his 3rd hotel, it was in Springfield, Massachusetts. And they had the hotel that he bought. It had a $10,000 neon sign, which was just the height of being as modern as you could possibly be. And yet the hotel was about to go bankrupt. Father, as a good New England Yankee, didn't want to tear the sign down because, wasting $10,000 on something that was so modern and exciting, he couldn't do it. He also figured that if you're going to have a chain of hotels, for advertising purposes, you want one name. You don't want to advertise 3 different hotels.
That makes sense.
So he named them all Sheraton. And the entire reason Sheraton is named Sheraton is that $10,000 neon sign.
Why? Was that the name of the sign?
The sign said Sheraton.
All right, so you get $10,000, but that's a lot in 1930, the height of the Depression.
It was probably a couple of $100,000 in today's money. But I always like that story because he could have named the hotel chain after himself. I mean, he could have called it the Henderson Hotels, but he didn't. And I'm kind of proud of him for having this New England Yankee trait of not wasting money. But then there was another kind of small fact that I think showed that he didn't have too big an ego, because he felt that Henderson his word was euphonious. It didn't have a ring to it. And so, again, that's how Sheraton got its name. And you mentioned a moment ago that he had some ways of, when he'd first take over a hotel, getting employee engagement.
Yeah.
I'd love to share that.
I would love to hear it. I mean, because I've heard it before, but I mean, the guests, I think, who haven't heard it, this is phenomenal. And it's so, different from what you would normally hear.
And yet it applies to today. When he'd take over a hotel, and usually, at least during the Great Depression, the hotels that he'd take over were ones that were going bankrupt. I mean, that he could afford to buy and that nobody else would bid against him. Well, the day he took possession, he'd invite all the employees, and there could be many hundreds of them. He'd invite them into the hotel's ballroom, and he'd stand up there in front of him, his new employees, and he knew that they were a really demoralized group of people. Because if you lost your job back then during a time of 25% unemployment, you weren't going to get another job. It meant the breadline. And so, just imagine how dispirited they were. Well, Father knew that. So the first words out of his mouth were, I want every one of you to keep your jobs. And I want you to keep your job because I know that you know your job better than anybody else in the world. And my job is to give you the resources and the encouragement to show the world just how good you are. And I believe in you. And you're going to see. In a few months, this is going to be the most popular hotel in the city. It'll be the best served. It will be an example to the rest of the city that even though times are tough, things can turn around. And you're part of that.
Wow.
So imagine how they felt, from being afraid of losing their job to this guy believes in me.
Yeah, totally edified. And he basically said, it's my responsibility to give you the resources to go forward.
And then he was very big in the idea that, words count, but in the end they're cheap. He wanted to show that he meant it. And so the next day, if a hotel's been teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, it's probably gone to seed with, stained carpets and frayed curtains and whatever. So he'd have to spend some money refurbishing the hotel. But he told me the first money that he ever spent on any hotel he ever took over was in areas that the paying public would never see. Now it would be in the areas where the employees had, say, their employee dining room or lockers or showers.
Wow.
So of course, I'm a little girl, and I asked him, how come you didn't spend the money where you'd get your money back faster? Spruce up the front of the hotel that the guests would see. And he said, no, he wanted to show the employees how important they were. And that was one of his ways of doing it. And his reason, one of them was, people have a compulsion to live up to or down to your expectations. And this was a way of showing that I believed in them and that I expected wonderful things from them.
I loved it. I love it. And that's so cool, because the first thing that they see, the employees see, is him coming in and fixing their locker rooms and their dining hall area. To me, that was just such a vote of confidence on top of what else he was saying earlier. So that was, no one else was doing stuff like that. That's when we hear of motivational speakers and stuff today, and just how to get people to come together as a team, or how to just have a different mindset and come, moving forward. He was ahead of the game. You know what I mean? He probably knew Earl Nightingale and some of these other people. He probably went to dinner with them.
Well, as far as I can tell, he was a self-help addict for his whole life, and I inherited that. I read books right and left on self-development. But there's a PS to that story,
Nice.
Which is, I'd ask him, how come? These are new employees. There's probably some dead wood in there somewhere. How come you promised everybody that they could keep their job? And this is another thing that I think applies to today. But he realized this, how many years ago? 90 years ago. He said that there are three ways, at least in his world, there are three major ways you can get people to do what you want. You can do it through intimidation. He said, I could have stood up there in front of them all and I could say, shape up or you're fired. He said, you'd probably get some people going along with you because, that is a way of getting your way. But he said, what's wrong with that and why it's just really not a good idea to do it? It's because people do it grudgingly.
Yeah, there's no loyalty.
Yeah, they'll do the least they can get away with.
Yeah.
Okay, in his world, the second way of getting people to do your way is bribery. He could have stood up there in front of them and said, do a good job, and there's a bonus in there. Do a good job, and there's a raise waiting for you. But he didn't do that. He said the trouble with bribery is it's too transactional. People will work for the bribe, but that's not what you really want an employee. You want the employee to go the extra mile and to use their love and energy and insight into making it the best possible. So he was against bribery. To the best of my knowledge, he never used intimidation or bribery. So what's left? Inspiration. He said that he wanted people not to feel that they were working for a bribe or working to avoid getting fired. He wanted them to be part of something bigger, part of a team. And so that woman who's maybe changing sheets in a hotel room or waiting on table, or a guy who's bartending, they aren't cleaning rooms or bartending or waiting table. What they're really doing is building the best hotel in the city. And that means that they're operating off of inspiration. So his phrase was, inspire, don't require. And the overall phrase for the whole thing, and this applies just as much today as it did back then, is, and this is the quote, this is almost my favorite quote. I got several, but this is almost my favorite quote. A leader's job is to give people a better vision of themselves.
Wow.
So if imagine you come to work and let's say, this is a pretty big stretch for you, Ronald, but imagine you're a chambermaid. Deal with it, do it, roll with it. You're a chambermaid.
Okay.
Imagine if you're just changing sheets all day long, cleaning up the messes that people leave. They're not very fun or very inspiring. But instead, imagine I'm part of a team. I'm part of something bigger than myself. I'm part of something that's going to change the dynamic of the whole city. Now you come with a lot more energy and commitment. And Father was absolutely famous for, if you started working with him, you probably stayed with him for life.
Wow, I love it. It reminds me about a story I heard from Richard Branson. He was talking about how when he went to one of his factories and he was on a tour, and he stopped and he asked one of the people who was sweeping the floor, "What do you do here?" He says, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." You know what I mean?
Exactly the same thing. The principles are timeless. You're part of something bigger than yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, and that was what I got from Richard Branson, and it seems that your father and him were on the same path. At least had that same mentality of inspiring people. And you're right, because if you're bribing them, they're working for the bribe. And when they get that bribe, they feel like they're done. They've accomplished their goal. There is a target. And then once the target's met, there's now, kind of like deflation. And where do they go from there, right? Unless you just give them another bribe. Whereas,
one of the things that Father said, he was very against bribery. He wanted people paid well. But he didn't want that to be the biggest motivation, because he said with bribery, people don't stay bribed. You always have to up the ante. Exactly. So much better that they have a better vision of themselves. And I love to hear that Richard Branson had that attitude. And something about Father that I found extraordinary is that he didn't start out with all this understanding of human nature. He, at age 26, and this is a kind of a favorite family story. He had just gotten engaged, and his mother told his fiancée, my mother, "Don't marry Ernest. He can never stick with any job. You'll end up poor." And, imagine your own mother saying that. But my mother said, "I don't care, I love him," and they got married, and guess what? They did not end up poor. No. But Father took this as an amazing wake-up call. He clearly had to make some changes if his own mother said that he could never stick with anything. Right. So he went to whatever the equivalent of the Yellow Pages was back in 1923. He found a career guidance counselor. The man's name was Johnson O'Connor. And Johnson O'Connor spent an entire day with him, giving him different tests, figuring out, why is it that Ernest can never stick with anything? Why can't he keep holding a job? Yep. And the conclusion was, this is what Johnson O'Connor told my father: "You have the worst human relations skills I've ever come across." He said, "You're clearly a bright fellow, but if you want to stick with a job, you've got to have some kind of circumstance where you don't interact with other people. And since you're smart, I recommend that you become a scientist and work in a laboratory where you don't have to interact with people." Well, dear Father took that as a challenge. But not only as a challenge, but he realized, and I've heard him say this, that most of getting along in life, it means getting along with other people. Exactly. And so that began a lifetime of studying what makes people tick. And I know, for example, that he took the Dale Carnegie course, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He also, he told me that he read that book every 10 years of his life just for a refresher course so you didn't miss any of it. But he took public speaking courses, he took salesmanship courses, he went to lectures, he read books. He even made friends with famous psychologists. And at our weekend house, there would be famous psychologists like B.F. Skinner, who was a big name back then, or Eddie Bernays, who I think is known as the head of the founder of modern advertising. I mean, it was a lifelong quest to figure out what motivates people, what makes them tick. And so 10 years later, when he's standing up in front of people who work for a hotel that he's just taken over, he probably had more understanding, because he had studied it so hard, than most of his competition in business. I mean, so like, for example, I mentioned that the first words out of his mouth when he's standing up in front of hundreds and hundreds of new employees, that the first words out of his mouth was, "I want you to keep your job." He did that because he was aware, he was putting himself in their shoes.
Right.
They're in so much pain and fear, they're probably not going to hear a word he's saying until he's taken away that fear. Yeah. But I could guess that one of the reasons that he started with no employees and ended up with 20,000 at the time of his death, I'm going to guess that his greatest defect, inability to understand or get along with people, became his greatest asset, because he worked so hard on it, and it gave him a competitive advantage over everybody else at the time.
Yeah, and it's so amazing that a lot of people probably when they heard that advice in the beginning, they would have been either defensive or they would have just rode with it. He saw it as, okay, you're only as strong as your weakest link. I need to fix this in order to be a whole person and to have a better life or whatever he wanted to have. So he took it. I mean, so many, probably 80-90% of people would have took that as a negative and then went off and got that job as an engineer or a scientist, right? Figuring, well, this guy must know what he's talking about. But your father took it as, it didn't disable him, it enabled him. It got him on a path to fix whatever was supposedly his deficiency, and clearly it wasn't. What I mean? Certainly later.
Yeah, I mean, imagine somebody who was told that you ought to be in a laboratory and never interact with people. At the end of his life, he owned 400 hotels, and he did more entertaining, in the hospitality industry, people are your business. And being a good host is your business. So again, his greatest deficit became his greatest asset, because he turned it around. And I have a philosophical question. Maybe I know it's your interview, but I want to explore something with you, if I may. It'll be an easy question, but philosophically, I'm kind of in favor of building on your strengths. And yet my father's career was built on turning around his weakness. What advice have you heard of whether you should build on your strengths or erase your weaknesses?
I've actually heard both. I heard one, when it comes to business, like learn it, do it, delegate it, but stay in your zone. Most of business stuff I hear from business, I don't want to say gurus, but people out there in the business forum now is basically stay in your lane. Whatever you're best at, stay doing that, and then delegate the rest. Bring people in, pay them to do whatever else you're not good at, because whatever, even if you spent that time to learn it, you'd never be as good as them. And chances are, most of the time, and then whatever you produce would not be as good. So if you spent 40 hours learning how to, let's say, make a website or do a blog or something else, that 40 hours, if you sold some type of a coaching package and, it was a $5,000 lifetime value of a client, And in that 40 hours, you could have talked to like 80 people.
Yeah.
5, you know what I mean? You could have made 25,000 while you were wasting time. But then I've also heard on the other side, as a person on an individual development level, because I used to be on a powerlifting team, you are only as strong as your weakest link. So if like your wrist or your ankles or your shoulder or whatever it was weak, you know, whatever lift, whatever you were doing, you know, the whole would suffer. So find out whatever your weakest link is, fix that, and everything else will grow. I mean, you continue to work on the other things, but make sure you focus on whatever your weakest link is. But I think most business people now are telling people, stay in your lane, stay in your zone, focus on what you're best at, and just delegate. Bring in other people to fill in those gaps. I know someone who tells people, you don't even do your own laundry. You know what I mean? Because don't do your own laundry, don't do your own cleaning, don't do your own ironing, because there's 10 hours, 15 hours a month that you could be spending, you know, interfacing with clients and maybe making 15 or 20 grand in that 15 hours, selling 3 packages, and you could have paid somebody $200 to clean your house. You know what I mean? So there was a disparity. So yeah, I've heard both sides of that story.
Maybe the answer is for things like getting along with people, you just got to fix that, because everything where, unless you're a scientist in the lab and don't interact with anybody, outside of that, everything else depends on it. So you got to fix that.
Yeah, you got to have interpersonal communication skills, especially if you're in any type of leadership role. If you own a company or you're a manager or a project manager, or you know, you have to have, even if you know, no matter what, you have to work on your interpersonal communication skills. So I agree with you 100%. And I'm so happy. I mean, just look at the legacy that your father is, what he learned, and then all those other people who benefited from, because he took that as something he needed to take care of. So now all those people had jobs. They paid their food to their families. I mean, there was such a ripple effect here.
And I think they were really proud of working for a company that Sheraton wasn't the biggest. I think Hilton was, but Father used to say, we're not the biggest, but we're the best. Nice.
And it was probably 100% accurate. But let's talk a little bit now about Frank Perdue.
Well,
how was that experience? How did you guys even meet, man? Where did you go? At a movie theater?
No, I was living in California, and I was in agriculture at the time. I was, as you can clearly tell by looking at me, I was a rice farmer.
A rice farmer?
I grew rice.
In California, okay.
In California, yeah, 17 years, 17 very, very happy years. But in 1988, I moved to Washington for 2 weeks to work on a presidential campaign that washed up in the primaries. And you know, at the last day, I was just so unhappy and miserable because I liked the guy. But in the end, I even stopped believing him when I got to watch him. And this is 1988. When I got to watch him up close and personal, I lost faith and thought he shouldn't be president. So here I've invested, you know, a couple of weeks of hotel bills and travel, and I don't even like my candidate anymore. But the last day, you know, before I was going to fly out that night, there was a party for people who had supported this guy. And I bet there were 100 people at the party, and Frank Perdue was there. But unfortunately, I had to leave early, and he arrived late, and we only overlapped by 10 minutes. But it took. We decided that chicken and rice would go well together.
In 10 minutes, huh? Really?
Well, actually, it was the first 5 minutes we were both divorced. And the first 5 minutes we're talking about how, I don't know how we got onto this, but how we would never under any possible circumstance consider remarriage, that marriage was an institution designed to make people miserable. And And then somewhere around 5 minutes into it, we started talking about how, we were enthusiastically agreeing with each other, but then we started discussing how that meant growing old alone. But that was our fate because we'd never trust anybody again. And then he looked down at me. Frank was tall. He looked down at me and he said, I believe I could trust you. And I looked up at him and I said, I believe I could trust you. And then we spent the next 5 minutes talking about what our marriage would be like. And it would be supportive and not competitive, and would be there for the good times with each other and would be there for each other for the bad times. And that's exactly what the remaining 17 years were like.
That is amazing. I mean, we should have led with that. So you now leave after a whopping 10-minute conversation, right? You guys went from divorces, can't trust anybody. It's
we're going to marry, and this is what our marriage will be like.
Exactly. And you mapped it all out. I mean, that's, definitely cutting to the chase. And so after 10 minutes, it was what? Here's the phone numbers. Let's get in touch next Tuesday. And
well, the only thing is at that time, I was president of American Agri-Women, which is the country's oldest and largest farm women's organization. And as president, I was visiting different chapters, and I didn't get back to California for 10 days. And this was an era before like texting, and we didn't have cell phones back then even. So I finally get back 10 days later, and there in my desk were all these pink message slips saying that Frank Perdue had called. There's probably like 10 or 12 phone calls. And just as I'm going through these messages and being so happy, I get a phone call, and it was Frank. And he said, I want you to know I've never been more serious in my life. And I said, me too. And so we spent an hour or two every night for probably 2 or 3 weeks. And then I came back to see him. And he gave me my engagement ring when I'd known him 5 hours.
Wow.
And then I had to go back to California to wind up my business. And the third time I ever saw him in my life was in New York City in the rectory of Reverend Draesel. Reverend Draesel was the minister who was going to marry us. Well, the Episcopalian Church at that time, 1988, I don't know if they still do or don't, but they had a 6 weeks prenuptial counseling period, and they wouldn't let you get married unless you'd gone through the 6 weeks prenuptial counseling. Well, we wanted to start the clock ticking. So this is the third time I've set eyes on this man in my life. I mean, I got off the plane from California and went to the rectory and met Frank there again. And Reverend Draesel said, I'm so happy for you. This is so wonderful. How long have you known each other? And I said, do you mean in person? He said, well, yes. And I said, 36 hours.
Working on 37.
Working on 37. Yeah, it'll be 37 at the end.
We're closing in on 37 if we can wait another 15 minutes.
Well, 6 weeks and 3 days after that. No, 6 weeks after that, we married. And it was blissfully happy, and it was exactly as we had promised each other right from the beginning. Yeah. And he was a very easy man. Yeah, his reputation is tough man, tender chicken. Yeah. But home, he was just the easiest to get along with person in the world because he was always fair. And I find it extraordinarily hard to argue with somebody who's just fair.
Yeah.
But he was a lot like my father in that I think he had an amazing understanding of human nature. And like my father, he always said that the reason for the success of Perdue Farms was the people he worked with, the people who worked for the company.
Right.
And he was always looking for ways to make the people who worked with him feel important. And there was one of these things that I had something to do with. And again, this is something that others could copy if they chose. If you're head of a company, big or small, here's what we did. Since I grew up in the hospitality industry, and I have the notion that getting together and getting to know each other just solves a whole host of problems. I had suggested to him, like the first week of our marriage, that we should entertain in our home every single person who worked for the company. And at that time, there were 16,000 people. And he said, that's way too many. But eventually he came around to the idea that since he was motivated by wanting to make people feel important, that, that's one of the best ways available to you. And 6 weeks after we married, we began having people in our home for dinner, 100 at a time, and would very deliberately invite people in groups that would know each other. So, for example, the truckers, the sanitation people, the secretaries, the veterinarians, everybody. But, I understood, since, I grew up in the hospitality industry, that having dinner at the big boss's home is probably somewhat scary. We did everything we could to make it comfortable for people. So not only would they be there with their friends that they worked with during the day, but we had a rule. It was kind of a joking rule, but we didn't want people to spend a week's salary on fancy clothes. So we said, we want you to come dressed for your sport. And our home had volleyball, badminton, tennis, horseshoes, pool. And so people, when they come, they're not standing around awkwardly trying to think, what do I say? Am I going to use the right spoon or something? No, you just start out playing pool or volleyball or whatever. And so, they were kind of jolly occasions. But Frank did something that I thought was so special. There was a great big buffet line when it's time for dinner. He would stand behind the buffet table, and there would be some waiters there as well. But he would wait on his employees. Is that not cool?
That is amazing.
And then at the end of the evening, he'd do something else that I thought was just spectacular for employee engagement. He'd be telling the people who, his name appears on their check, so he's the big boss, but he'd tell them as if they were the board of directors what was going on in the company, just hot off the press, latest information of what the problems were, what the challenges were, what the successes were. And I think people have a much higher level of engagement if they know the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yep.
And then at the end of every evening, he'd tell them in different words, but it would always kind of boil down to this: I know the company wouldn't be what it is today if it weren't for each of you. Thank you. And what must it mean to somebody who's like 10 layers down in the company to have the big boss personally thank him?
And serve him and bring him into his house and tell him what's going on in the country. I mean, both Frank Perdue and your father, they were just so well versed in how to treat people. To me, it's like we don't hear about stuff like that anymore. Maybe it's happening and I just haven't heard about it, but that's outstanding. We have about 7 minutes left.
I'm gonna die. I want more.
Yeah, I know, but this is the second time you'll be on. Each time you come on, it's more and more. This is amazing. That story about you and Frank is really cool. I met my girlfriend in an ice cream store. We're celebrating our second year coming up in September 2nd.
Oh, how wonderful. Oh, yeah. I'm happy for you. Nothing's better than romance. Nothing.
Yeah. And I joke with her, though. I said, that day you did meet your Mr. Right. And she goes, yeah, I'm still wondering. I says, no, you did. It was just he was the guy behind me.
Oh, and I do think humor is just
the right guy.
I love it. Okay, goes, so how do we spend our 7 minutes? And I really want 200, but...
Huh?
I was saying, how do we spend our 7 minutes, even though I really want 200?
Well, yeah, you got to come back on. You have so much personality and so much history of, everything that this show is about how to create more success, how to learn from others who have been there, get mentors, not advise, all that stuff. what you have taught it already is so valuable. I hope that you'll come on like once a month or once every 6 weeks, wherever your schedule can allow. Because
I love being with you. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, you're just on such like a high level of, you know, personal being there and done that with, you know, hugely, massively successful endeavors. So I mean, the value that the listeners get is just tremendous. Let's talk about your book now.
Okay, I do want to talk about this book. It's How to Be Up and Down Times, and I wrote it with Mark Victor Hansen. And I think almost everybody knows about him, but just in case, because, this is an advertising principle of Frank. He said 98% of the people might know about a particular thing, but don't leave out the 2% because they count too. So in case you don't know who Mark Victor Hansen is, although I hope you do, he's the co-author of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series, and he's in the Guinness Book of World Records for selling 500 million with a B, 500 million books. Well, I got to write this book with him because I'm a writer by trade. I'm a science writer and I'm a health writer, and I have been for about 40 years. And I suggested to him, since you're one of the most inspirational people in the world, and since I have a science background, what if we put it together to help people through the tough times of the pandemic? And well, he liked the idea, and we wrote this book. It's 40 tips to get you through. And we wrote it in about 3 weeks. We started pretty much at the beginning of February, and it was ready for people to buy about maybe 4 weeks later, because it took Amazon a little while. But I wanted to share a tip with everybody, something that I think maybe I know. If you look at the top of this, it's kind of bare, it doesn't say anything, and I'm about to hold up something that Mark Victor Hansen recommended that I do. This is just a paper, but let's see if I can get it close enough to, is this mirror reading, or can you actually read what it says?
I can read what it says.
It says more than 1 million copies sold. Did you see that?
Yep.
Okay, that's not true, but it's not fake advertising either. Mark is a big believer in visualization, and he said a lot of his success is he visualizes success. And he asked me one day, I'm a black belt in Photoshop, and he said, I want you to make a mock-up of the book, and put more than 1 million copies sold, and then print it out and put copies in bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, office, every stairwell, and just think about selling 1 million copies. Well, I've written books before, and I think 5,000. I'd never crossed my mind to think of 1 million, but suddenly I'm thinking of 1 million. Yeah. A woman from Taiwan whom I've never met, she tells me that she bought one copy, liked it, and bought 200 more to give to her friends. And then other people began saying, we're buying copies because this really makes a difference in people's life. This is the book that was meant for this time. And I think that Mark's visualization is how about a magic secret that I'd never even heard of before? But visualize what you want, and then that will sort of train your mind to start thinking of ways of getting there, things that you've never thought of before, and it works.
I love it. Yeah, sort of like the law of attraction. And, you think it, you put it out there, you say it factually, not if or I will or I'll try, but you factually say it, and it's just a matter of time until it comes about. You just will it. And,
although I also am in favor of, now that I'm thinking 1 million copies, I'm doing all sorts of things that I wouldn't do otherwise, including being more aggressive about telling people about it. Hey, everybody, I'm talking to you. This is a great book, and it'll change your life. And it's only $4.65 because Mark and I wrote it to be useful to people, to help get them through tough times. And there's medical information, there's spiritual information, there's physical information. There's just stuff that will help you get through this in far better shape than you would otherwise. And the reason for the low price is we didn't write it to make money. We wrote it to help people, and that was pretty much the minimum price that Amazon would let us put on it for a book this size.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, we're definitely going to have you on again. In the last minute or so, in closing, would you like to say anything to the viewers and listeners?
Yes, I would. You'll see at the bottom of the screen, scrolling along, AuntMitzi.com. If you will go there, there's 5 chapters that are available to you free.
Wow.
And you'll get a taste for what it's like. And I'd really love you to come visit there. And if you feel like sending me a message, I make an absolute, practice of answering emails, because if you take the time to write me, I'm honored and flattered. I will answer you.
I love it. And I know you've answered my emails and texts and Facebook messages. So, Mitzi, you're amazing, man. You're really a great person today for who you are and what you've accomplished, and also what you've experienced through others is just so much information. Thank you so much for being on here and blessing our listeners and viewers.
Well, I really want to take you up on your offer to come back. And at that point, I'll tell about my anti-trafficking efforts, anti-human trafficking.
That'd be huge. That's very important. I mean, we don't hear enough about that. I mean, I heard some crazy statistic like 800,000 kids go missing a year or something insane. 800,000. I mean, that's over a big city. I mean, that's crazy.
It is crazy. And I think it's the most evil thing in the world. But I have things that you can do. You don't have to just say, this is awful. No, I've got things that if you'll do them, you're going to feel better about yourself, because you're making the world a better place.
Excellent. We're going to definitely have you on, and we'll schedule you sometime in September towards the end, and that will be our focus point. We might talk about these other things a little bit, but we'll definitely focus on that, or we'll start there and then move into other things. But thank you so much. It's always a pleasure speaking to you. You just got a great personality, and your history is just tremendous.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you to Mark and his wife for introducing us. You know, that's how I got to meet you, is he suggested that I interview you. So Mark Victor Hansen. So thank you, Mark, again.